Namaskar and welcome to this edition of Insight. I am Charu Karthikeyan. Today we'll be talking about the state of education. Human Resource Development Minister M.M. Pallam Raju recently released the annual Status of Education Report 2012 prepared by the NGO Pratham. This report has been making a lot of headlines and a lot of them for worrying reasons. In this edition of Insight, I'll be trying to find out what are the things that this report points out towards, and also we'll be trying to find out from several experts who have been watching the education sector how many concerns that the report seems to be flagging seem justified, and what is being done to rectify the situation. So all of that and much more in this edition of Insight. Joining me in an Insight today is a delightful panel of experts. On my extreme left is Senior Fellow with the Center for Policy Research, Ms. Kiran Bhatti. Ms. Bhatti has also been the RTE Coordinator for the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. Thank you so much, Kiranji, for joining us here. Right next to her is Amit Kaushik, been in the education sector for a very long time, served in the Ministry of HRD on programs like the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, and presently working as Managing Director with Educom Schools. Amit, thank you so much for joining us here. Right here with me, Urmi Goswami, Special Correspondent with the Economic Times, been following the education sector for a very long time. Urmi, thank you so much for joining us here. Kiranji, first of all, I would like to begin with you. The thing about the annual Status of Education report that newspapers or press reports have chosen to highlight is the first fact that it does point out a sharp fall in learning outcomes, and there are other things that it raises questions about the way RT is being implemented. But to begin with positives, what are the positive takeaways from the annual State of Education report?
Well, I guess the positives only relate to some improvement in perhaps infrastructure facilities or the RTE parameters that the report has highlighted. For instance, PTR ratios. It says there's some improvement in the PTR ratios in moving towards the RTE compliance. Similarly, better perhaps some more classrooms, some more water and toilet facilities, largely relating to infrastructure. On learning outcomes, that's where the big question mark is, and what is alarming is not just that the learning outcomes are not going up, but in fact they are declining. And particularly sort of interesting and in this report is the fact that even in private schools where particularly reading is concerned, there is no increase in the learning quality. So really the crisis is across the board in a sense in the education sector, and it does show perhaps the complete lack of priority that is given to education right from the top policy makers, political class, etc. That despite the fact that the education has been made a fundamental right, we are in fact still continuing to see on the whole a decline in what is happening in the schooling system. So very few positives, I would say, for now, except for there is some sense of compliance in terms of RT indicators.
How much of these assessments do you feel compelled to believe?
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't. There is no reason to not believe, in a sense, what the asset has to show. It's an organization. I mean, Pratham has been doing this for the last few years. They have a fairly well entrenched system, and I don't see any reason to not believe. I think we all know very well that learning outcomes haven't been increasing in government schools. There is a great deal of exit into the private sector, precisely because the quality of the government schools has been going down. I don't want to comment on the exact figures because that unless one sees the sample and really looks at their methodology, etc. So they might be, one could perhaps quibble on those, but I think on the whole the trend that they show, I would not take up cudgels against the basic trend that they are showing, which is that there is a decline in quality. In fact, now they're also saying that there is not at least an increase, or the private sector is not in fact providing too much of a better alternative. So I think that for the country as a whole, I think this is a big question mark, that if neither sectors is really being able to deliver, where are we at and who needs to take responsibility for the state of affairs? Okay.
I mean, in your experience, how exhaustive are Pratham's reports? For the latest report, I believe the figures that I have, that it reached out to about 6 lakh children and 3.3 lakh households, covering more than 16,000 villages in 567 districts of the country. Seems to be a fairly large number. But given the overall experience with the annual State of Education reports, this is the eighth report. How exhaustive are these reports, and how much should we be in a position to trust the indications or the concerns that these reports point out?
Well, I would say that I agree with Kiran, for example, that the absolute numbers that these reports bring out are not necessarily what you should be focusing on.
Okay.
What the report is doing and what it set out to do way back in 2006 when the first report was released is actually just providing a snapshot view of where we stand vis-a-vis children and schools at a given point in time. I do believe that while you can always question why a particular statistical methodology is adopted, but I do believe that whatever the methodology they have adopted, it is done in a fairly rigorous manner. It's not done only by Pratham. There are several other NGOs that are involved with this exercise.
Okay.
There are volunteers like you and me who also go out into the villages with questionnaires trying to get them filled up, and young college students and so on. So there's no reason to doubt the veracity of the exercise. But yes, I think given that Pratham is also only trying to provide a sort of a mirror to society in a sense, one should look really at the trends emerging from these reports rather than the absolute numbers.
Okay.
And to me those trends are fairly disturbing. I think one thing that Kiran perhaps omitted, which I would say is a serious positive in this report, is the fact that 96% kids in the 6 to 14 year age group are still enrolled in school. Right? That is something that has been consistent in the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
So to that extent, I think we're doing well. But what is seriously disturbing is the fact that learning levels are falling in such a drastic sort of manner, and that there is such a strong movement away from public schools into the private sector. So I think those are two takeaways that this report leaves with us.
Okay, Urmi, your take on that?
Well, I actually agree with both Kiran and Amit.
Okay.
Now, again, the numbers, the absolute numbers are not as important as the trend they indicate. But equally important is what do we do next? Because the fact that learning outcomes are low, the Pratham report and even NCERT when it comes out with its report indicates that there are questions about learning outcomes. Nobody in their right minds would say that kids are learning, and the truth is that no part of our education system, whether government or private, has covered itself in glory. As a matter of fact, the same Pratham report also says that math outcomes in private schools has been declining. Reading is holding steady. So basically there's nobody who can say we have done well. If holding steady is good, I guess holding steady is good, but it's not. So the real question is why it is happening and what can be done to address those, and I think that's where the attention should be, instead of the focus of the numbers, because there will be quibbles about what kind of methodology has been used, whether it's the right one, but the picture it presents or the indications it gives is what should cause us worry. One reason perhaps is the way we structure our education system, which is very textbook based, and the teachers don't actually get to exit from their textbooks, and that becomes a problem given that if I just take the government sector, which according to the latest flash statistics from DICE for 2011-12, government enrollment accounts for 76.55% of all enrollment. That's a pretty high number, and in the rural areas. Now, a large number of these kids are going to be first generation learners, or at best, if they're lucky, their siblings have gone into school. They have no assistance at home, so the school is everything. They probably speak a language at home which is very different from the language they're going to be learning in. So in classes 1, 2 and 3, I do expect that when you go and test them for learning in Hindi or in English, they are bound to do badly because they have to make a huge leap with virtually no assistance from home. That is the reason why I say that we should start looking at the reasons for the low learning outcome. Maybe it's not that our kids are not learning enough. Maybe we are testing the wrong things. Maybe we need to also have a schooling system that is much more sensitive to the realities. In Rajasthan, if you go to a NREGA site, you will see kids, girl children from between the ages of 10 and 14 actually there looking after the younger siblings. Why is that so? Because you do not have adequate child care systems in place, though the law requires you to have them. So the oldest girl child is actually co-opted into being a caregiver while the mother is the wage earner.
Okay.
So the girl can't go to school. Now tomorrow she gets tested by Pratham or anybody else, there is a very high possibility that she'll fail the learning outcome test. So, you know, it's not a simple answer. I mean, but the fact is, yes, Pratham every year for the last 8 years has been telling us this. The fact is that the numbers this year seem to be worrisome, and are worrisome. Seem is a wrong word. They are worrisome, but they have been worrisome for the last 8 years. I think it's time we start looking at the reasons behind it and start addressing those.
But the big difference between when Pratham started compiling these reports and now is this gap, which was the highlight of this gap, this interregnum, has been the introduction of the Right to Education Act, and that is one thing that has also been generating a lot of headlines, that this report essentially seems to be pointing out that Right to Education Act is not taking care of the biggest problems of the education sector in India. It's time for us to slip into a very short break. When we come back, we'll talk about that. Do stay tuned to Insight. Welcome back. You're watching Insight, and today we are talking about the Annual State of Education Report 2012. Ms. Bhatti, is enrollment not a big positive? Because that is something that that Amit says that we need to remember. We need to understand that this is something, a big positive that Pratham is presenting, that if 96.5% of all children in the age group that the RTE takes care of, if they were enrolled, then this is something that we must congratulate ourselves.
I think what
about.
it indicates is the desire for education that is now across the board, across even the poorest of households in our country. It certainly indicates that every parent is determined and is keen to have his or her child educated in some kind of schooling facility. The problem with not being very sort of excited about this number is that enrollment doesn't by itself tell us what is the actual attendance and retention of the child, and that's where the real story, and that reflects in the learning outcomes as well. So that's the real story here, is that despite the high enrollment, despite the high desire and demand for education, the system is actually not delivering, and in fact these children who are enrolled are likely to be extremely irregular, and because they are irregular, they will not. So when you test an irregular child, it's not surprising that you have results where they haven't actually learnt much. Actually, unfortunately, the government does not have a very good measure for the out-of-school child. Typically, it is noted as a child that is enrolled in the first year, doesn't continue till the second year, and is counted as a dropout, or a child that is never enrolled. But in fact, I would argue, in NCPCR we did try to put that forward, that an out-of-school child is also one that doesn't attend regularly, because in effect that child is out of school. In effect, that child is not getting any education. In effect, that child is actually a potential dropout in any case. And if one was to look at those figures, then one would have a very different figure of the actual out of child school, and that is the more relevant statistics than the statistic that has been presented in ASAR and in official statistics of the enrolled or out of school child. So I think we must really start to focus now on what is happening regularly in schools, how many children are in fact going to school regularly. That will give us an indication of why we have such poor learning outcomes. And as Urmi has rightly pointed out, we have to start looking at the reasons for why year after year ASAR is presenting us with statistics that are getting more and more worrisome. And definitely part of the story lies in the fact that schools are not retaining children. Part of the story lies in the fact that despite high enrollment, in fact the retention is extremely low, and clearly there is the reasons there are to do with the teaching and learning processes that are taking place in the classroom and what is happening to that. And we really need to start examining that much more closely, and of course that takes us to many steps behind what goes on in the education system.
Amit, please correct me if I'm wrong, but for the past several years enrollment has not really been the biggest of the problems affecting the education sector. The biggest problems are what happens after enrollment, whether retention takes place, whether teachers actually attend school, what kind of teaching is imparted, whether everybody is being able to, whether schools are being able to retain students as well as teachers, and a good learning outcomes are being provided. So in that sense, the indications or the concerns that this report points out towards RTE, towards the way RTE is being implemented, towards the actual negligible impact that RTE is being able to have on the biggest problems concerning the education sector. Your take on that?
Well, I have to say I agree. I mean, you're absolutely right. The issue of enrollment has not really been such a major issue from pretty much the time the first ASER report came out, when I think they reported that some 93 or 94% kids were in school. So 94% has become 96 now. There's not much of a difference. Yeah. So in terms of, and I agree with Kiran's point that, you know, in terms of the number of children registered in a school, which is enrollment, the numbers have not changed. So the kids are definitely enrolled. Whether they're attending or not, that is of course a completely different ball game. Whether the teachers are attending or not, different situation altogether. So you know, mere enrollment by itself is obviously not enough. The RTE has been implemented effective 2 years ago and has very noble intentions behind it. But noble intentions do not always translate into good policy, unfortunately. And I think what we are seeing, I'm inclined to agree with the analysis that the report itself contains, which is that the trend that we're witnessing of falling achievement levels may actually have a lot to do with provisions in the RTE, which have done away with examinations, which have done away with external testing, which are now relying on continuous comprehensive evaluation, which actually is a concept that different states are interpreting in different ways, and, you know, in a manner that sort of suits their understanding of the concept itself. And I think that you know, the sort of easing of pressure on the system as a whole probably contributes in some way to what we're looking at.
Okay. When we talk about something that Amit mentioned, the RTE system of lack of examinations, the CCE, the Continuing Comprehensive Evaluation, in that sense, Pratham sort of validates a lot of concerns that a lot of teachers have been making, who have been massively, hugely upset with the CCE, and that is this shifting of the focus away from examinations and a rigorous evaluation of what the student is being taught. That is something that the teachers had been upset with, and Pratham, this ASER also seems to be validating it, that it is actually not working to improve learning outcomes. Your take on that?
Well, the first thing is, as you rightly pointed out, the move is away from examination to rigorous and continuous evaluation. Unfortunately, somewhere along the way, this continuous comprehensive evaluation has become no examination. It is not the case. Because it was felt that a year-end exam or a semester-end exam or half-yearly or an annual exam is not a good measure of a child's learning, not just learning of, you know, addition, subtraction or reading, but general learning of actually understanding, of analyzing, whatever the levels are. Now, the problem is that there has been a gap, and it is true that states, many states like Bihar, Jharkhand, they have come back and they have said that, you know, in practice schools say that this means no examinations, and this no examination system is bad. But CCE is not about no examination. It is really about having evaluations or examinations or assessments at intervals pre-decided by, say, a classroom teacher. She decides on the basis of her child's ability when and how to assess them. Now, yes, the RTE effectively got implemented 2 years ago, so I think it's early days, but much more work needs to be done on getting this through, that we have not moved to a system of no examination. I think a part of it is also the circumstances we go into. Like in an urban area, say in a city like Delhi, CCE may be more successful. Obviously in urban settings it will be, because the parent understands what it is. Perhaps it's easier to explain, it's easier to implement.
No, but from my own experience, teachers are really upset
with the
CCE in Delhi.
It means more work.
It means a lot more work. It means a lot of work for them, and they're also upset about the fact that the student does not seem to be interesting. It is not working for the student to push him to learn more.
I think it's a little too early.
It's a little early.
But Sorry.
And they also need a lot more training. I think teachers haven't been given sufficient training.
Okay.
It does mark a very drastic change in the way the interaction between the teacher and child has been continuing all
Yeah.
this while. I mean, the kind of system that we had for so many years, which we have all criticized, and the system of annual exam, which is like a flush system, blah, blah. This completely puts an end to that and has turned it around on its head. Now, that kind of a change is bound to create some, transition problems, etc. The teachers are, they don't know anything else. They've been trained in a system which has an annual exam. Now suddenly they have to do continuous comprehensive. There is not enough training being given yet.
Yeah.
The RTE Act came, and from the next day they had to adopt this new system. It's going to take time, and changing attitudes of the teacher towards children, towards the processes of teaching and learning, these are not simple matters. This will require a long time. It will require a lot of training and a lot of hand-holding through this process, which it's true that I think the government hasn't done perhaps enough, needs to really sort of step up in that direction. But we also need to be a little bit more patient before we write the final word, and I, in that sense, do not agree with Asar's assessment. I think it's a little too early to pass that kind of judgment on this.
Okay.
What I would like to add is, even in as you said, even in a city like Delhi, you have teachers who are upset. Mind you, there are way more resources. It's probably, as we all said, they have to work more, they have to reorient themselves.
Yeah, they have a lot of paperwork to do. They have a lot of papers to take care of. They have cupboards and cupboards full of papers.
Exactly. So that is a, you have to...
They're upset about that.
Yeah, you have to reorient the way you look at the classroom, and you look at assessment. But just imagine how much tougher it is in the rural area. You anyhow had, in an extremely backward area, you have already had so much difficulty in getting a teacher. So you really are not getting the top of the heap to go there. So that person needs way more assistance than the teacher in Delhi, and this is where the government needs to step in. You want to make this work, you need way more assistance than you're getting now. You need to let the teacher define for themselves according to the kid in the class. A bureaucrat in Delhi or a social worker in Patna will not be able to tell you what a child is studying, what a child is like in Sitamarhi. It's not right. So you should let the teacher actually have more say. And as I said earlier, the textbook has started to define what we teach in the classroom. It should not be the defining moment in the classroom. And if the moment you step out of the textbook, you will step out of the way you evaluate, because you won't have fixed norms. You won't have that, teacher's guide that says, okay, after 3 weeks you have to evaluate the students for if they can recognize all the letters of the alphabet. You would be probably doing it differently.
Amit,
sorry, I just wanted to add to that. There's a lot more to this than, it's not just about the teachers. I think it's important to remember that education, we sort of tend to discuss education in isolation. It's not actually in isolation. It's part of the entire socio-economic system, political system that exists in the country. So when you talk about changing attitudes, you're looking at actually changing the way society deals with children and how society looks at young people learning. You still have instances in rural areas in the heartland of India where Dalit children, for example, will be made to sit separately. Okay. Now, unless the attitude of the teachers changes, these kids are always going to have a problem, and the attitude of the children will not change unless society changes as well. So sometimes I think we tend to get lost in discussing education as only something about schools and teachers and children. Actually, it's about the whole big world of
I think it's schooling and the education, and the school itself plays a big role in starting some of that
society.
change
Absolutely.
in society.
I'll come back to that. So now, Amit, I wanted your take on what we've been talking about. When Asar presents a critique, when Asar says that the CCE is not working, does Asar mean that it needs to be junked or tweaked, or maybe there are certain things which need to be taken care of that have not been taken care of by now?
I think that's a little unfair to ask us that question, because none of us here.
No, but what does the report seem to be saying? What does the assessment seem to be saying?
But I don't think that. No, I don't think the report is saying that at all. What the report is saying is that prima facie, it appears that this may be one of the causes contributing to what we're looking at, or the results.
Falling learning outcomes
that we're seeing. But I don't think that they're making the case that we should junk either the Right to Education Act or CCE. I agree with Kiran. I think it's early days yet, and one has to wait and see how this is going to play out. There are a lot of factors that will sort of affect what how successfully the act is implemented and how successfully CC is implemented.
Yeah.
So I think it would be premature to say anything at this point.
Okay. Well, on that note, we are slipping into a short break. There is one thing about the Right to Education Act that Asar also points out to us, and it says that if there is one area in which RTE has brought in a lot of improvement is that infrastructure. What do our experts feel about that? All that on the other side. We are slipping into a very short break. Do stay tuned to Insight. Welcome back. You're watching Insight, and today we are talking about the issues highlighted by the Annual Status of Education Report 2012. One of the things that, as I mentioned before slipping into the break, that Asar points out is that RTE has definitely led to an improvement in infrastructure in schools. For example, more toilets have been constructed so that female students across the country can feel more comfortable in going to schools. There has been an improvement in classroom infrastructure also. Do you find all of that true, or more or less true to the situation?
Well, if I compare it to the DICE data, which is district-wise data that's collected, it seems to bear out. Yes, there is improvement in infrastructure. Of course, the truth is that even now only about 41% of rural schools have electricity connections, and this is schools irrespective of who manages them. But yes, there has been an improvement. Is there a long way to go? Yes, there is a long way to go, because there is never enough. A school can never be, there can never be fewer toilets, or a library facility that is enough. You have to improve its stock. There is improvement, and that's a good thing. The issue is that, are we being able to use that to keep children in school? Is that enough? Like, one of the reasons why you have a drop in girls' attendance of schools is the absence of a toilet. Now, is the presence of a toilet actually ensuring that they're not inhibited from coming to school? If that is happening, then it's a great thing. That those correlations have to be sort of worked out.
Okay. Ms. Bhatti, private schooling is increasing. That is something that Asar points out, and in the age group that the RTE takes care of, Asar even does some crystal ball gazing, looking at the figures, and says that in the next 5 years the country may have half of the children attending private schools, even in the rural areas. Very interestingly, even the HRD minister has accepted, and he said that I will not grudge this trend, because it is important that our kids get educated, and to quote him, if it is in private schools, so be it. We will try and match up to those conditions. What does this indicate, the increase in private schooling?
Clearly, it indicates the fact that because the quality in the government schooling is going down, parents are looking for other options, alternatives to their children's education, because they are very keen to have their children educated. What it also indicates equally is actually that they have very little influence on the quality of the government school. Actually, this is actually an individual response, in a sense, a parent getting somewhat frustrated and fed up, and then finding for himself or herself an alternative option. Unfortunately, there is no collective public pressure that is being able to bear on the quality of the government school and try and enforce any kind of improvement in quality there. I think this is one of the problems, crises that does exist, and why government school quality has been steadily going down. As parents with slightly better income levels take their children out and put them in private schools, what is happening is that the government schools are now being catered to by the poorest and those at the bottom of sort of the economic hierarchy or social hierarchy, if you like, and those people have very little voice, and therefore they are unable to bring about any change in the government school, and which is really a part of the big problem that exists currently. Now, the RTE has certainly given a legal instrument or a framework of rights which can be used, but it will still require a kind of collectivization of the community, some more sort of capacity building there, so that they are able to, and some accountability systems that teachers and the government school is accountable actually eventually to the people, and they start delivering on in the way that they're supposed to. And then I'm quite certain that you might see in fact a counter trend, that people would start putting their children back in government schools. And in fact, if you go around in the countryside and ask parents this question, they would happily put their kids in government schools if only they would function better. So it's very clear that government schools have to start looking about improving their quality, and the government should not think that, you know, let the private sector come in so that, you know, we some of their responsibilities is taken off their hands and put in the hands of the private sector. Frankly, private sector doesn't have the capacity in today's date to be able to provide universal education to the large, you know, to all of the children in our country. Even today, by ASAR and DICE data, more than 75%, nearly 80% children still go to government schools. That is, and the parents actually have a lot of hope and expectation from the government school. It's just that they are not seeing that change. They're not seeing the quality improvement taking place there, which is why they are in utter frustration trying to. But if we do improve the quality, and I really think now that it is a fundamental right, it is the government, it is the state's responsibility to put their money where their mouth is and start really seriously working at improving the quality of the schools. I just want to very quickly respond to the infrastructure question. The fact is that SSA focused on infrastructure. SSA has been around for more than 10 years, and I think it is really a sad reflection of the fact that despite a decade of SSA having been there, we still don't even have 50% of schools with toilet and water, considering that is perhaps the only thing that they focused on.
Actually, 85% have girls' toilets. So
yeah, I'm not. I have.
DICE figures.
We don't know the functionality of some of this, and unfortunately, DICE doesn't comment on that. Unfortunately, our statistics do not verify the figures through the community, and if we were to start doing that verification by the people, I'm sure we'll have very different statistics. So I think that is really the alarming part. That even though infrastructure is not the basis for good quality education, we do need to have basic infrastructure, and today to have more than 50% of schools still lacking in very basic infrastructure, I think it still tells a story. We cannot shortchange the fact that infrastructure is important. Teachers don't like to come to schools where there is no infrastructure, so it's not all of a story, but let's not forget that we do have to put that fix that as well when we talk about
I'd like to just respond very quickly to something that
finish, then you can respond. Because in this private school thing, one of the reasons, if you ask parents, even in the poorer people in urban areas, why they are ready to pay to go to a private school, the first thing they'll tell you is because the teacher is present in the classroom. Actually, nobody goes through the other end to say how much they are learning. The presence of a teacher, and the second reason is English, and depends on where you are, computers. Three things that seem to determine a choice towards private schools. So the fact is that the government schools need, government and government agencies need to ensure that the teacher is at least present in the classroom. Going through the motions of taking a class, and that could actually see people returning to government schools. You know, because there are a whole lot of people who are not exactly, you know, when we talk about private schools, the only image that most people have in mind are the schools that we are aware of, that is a DPS, a Modern, a Sardar Patel, but not all private schools fall into that category. Not all private schools are fancy private schools. So we are talking about a whole lot of schools where actually the infrastructure is probably poor or poorer than a government school.
The quality of teachers certainly is there, untrained teachers.
But the fact is the teacher is present in class, and that becomes a big thing. Imagine a first generation learner. Parents know very little, maybe they're functionally literate, so they can sign their name. What they want is that my kid is going to school and has somebody teaching them. If that somebody is not present in class, if somebody is not there, then the child is not learning. So I'm going to save up money and send them where I think they'll learn. Whether they learn or not becomes a second question. This is the big thing that the government needs to address, that you have to have teachers, and I don't know if government alone can address it. You know, the Right to Education talks about school management committees. But not all schools I'm just focusing rural areas. I think about 69% of schools in rural areas have a school management committee. A school management committee has parents, has teachers, has local functionaries. You need to have those, and this is the pressure group. This is the group, because remember the fact that you have high enrollment, even if they're not attending classes, it means that people are interested in getting their kids educated. So this is the pressure group that's going to happen. And frankly, I don't think the private sector can step in, because if they haven't been able to, look, ASAR itself
It does not have the capacity, as Mr.
yes,
said.
it's not having the capacity, and it's not delivering.
Okay, Amit would beg to differ.
Well, I think I'm going to differ on several counts, but just on your last point about this community, unfortunately, the entire discourse around school education in this country somehow has identified this heterogeneous, this homogeneous sort of community which can influence what happens inside the school and so on and so forth. The truth is, as an educated person, I sent my school to my child to a fairly well-known school in Delhi, and I didn't interact with the school at all. I was not a part of the PTA. I did not feel I had a voice, or I had the authority to talk to the principal or to the teachers, etc. If somebody like me feels like this, imagine how an illiterate person sitting in a rural village somewhere who has been suddenly nominated as member of the school management committee is going to feel. He's not going to interact from a position of empowerment. He's going to interact from a position of disempowerment. So this sort of theoretical community pressure that we seem to believe will make everything right, in my view, doesn't exist.
Okay, so what will make it right?
Let me just complete what I was saying. I don't think it's anyone's case that the private sector can provide universal elementary education. That's not the role of the private sector.
Okay.
The role of providing universal elementary education is actually that of the government.
Okay.
However, we seem to have taken the view that it shall be the government that shall also deliver it. And that's where the problem arises. There is a huge space in India today for the private sector to come in and be part of the service delivery organization. There is no reason why the private sector cannot supplement the efforts of the government. Let the government regulate what is happening, let the government keep track of what is happening, and be the people who are mandated by law to actually ensure provision of elementary education. But that doesn't mean you can't bring in a private partner who will bring in management practices, who will bring in investments, who will bring in transparency, because the moment you have a private company coming in, you have a company that is regulated by the Companies Act. They're required to file income tax returns. So, there is a lot of transparency that suddenly comes in, as opposed to the situation that currently exists, where you have a maze of regulation and you are compelling organizations to actually bend the law, if not quite break it. Okay. As far as the actual business
So the private sector has the capacity, you're saying?
I'm saying that there's a great deal of interest in the private sector. There's a lot of investment that is available, but people are staying back because they don't want to get involved in the kind of maze of regulations we currently have. Change these regulations, make it easier for people to invest, and you will find that a lot of money will come in to supplement what the government is currently doing.
Okay.
The fact is that there are private schools across the country. The fact that, we are saying that about 20 to 23% of kids are going to private schools means that these private schools exist. I think somewhere we always get caught in this debate. It starts with learning outcomes and we move to who manages schools. Fact is, kids are not learning, and kids are not learning because teachers are not teaching, and that is where the focus should be. We should be looking at what we are getting our kids to learn. I keep coming back to the textbook culture, where your teaching is limited by textbooks. If the further we move away from our capital city, the more we realize how much how much the teacher is limited by the textbook, how much the fact that the teacher has to teach in a language which the kid is not speaking at home. Just imagine that you have a 5-year-old child who goes to school and the teacher speaks to the child in French. The child is lost. If you do not have the ability to coach the child in French at home, the child is completely lost. At the end of the first year, I am very sure the child, if tested, is highly likely to have failed the test, simply because you don't have that backing. So I think those are the places where we have to focus. Yes, this question of whether private players should be there or not be there is a separate debate, and can continue to happen. But the truth is that we need to be focusing on our teachers
training
and what they do in the classrooms, and why our kids are not learning.
Okay. So the teachers training also is something that needs to be looked into. What is being done on that front and what can be done, some of the things that I'll be trying to take a look at on the other side. It's time for us to go to a very short break. Stay tuned to Inside. Welcome back. You're watching Insight, and today we are talking about the Annual Status of Education Report 2012. Ms. Bhatti, quite pertinent that we devote the last segment of the discussion to a very integral part of this entire chain of education, that is the teachers themselves. As Urmi pointed out, that kids are not learning because the teachers are probably not being able to teach them better. What is being done as far as teachers training is concerned, and what needs to be done?
Yeah, I think that is definitely the most crucial aspect, or the sort of, in this whole story, is what's happening with teachers. And in that too, like in many other areas of education, there has been a steady decline. The institutions that provide training to teachers, diets, etc., they are in a state of absolute dysfunction, and that's partly why we have the kind of quality of teaching learning that takes place in the classrooms. Teacher training institutes, teacher education institutes, all of them have sort of just been thoroughly neglected. Curriculums for teacher education have not been sort of reviewed, revised in decades perhaps. So I think really a large part of the story does lie in reform in not only these institutions, in a whole new way of thinking about. These are lots of small private teacher training institutes that have come up. They are not regulated, so the quality of the teacher that you are sort of bringing up in the system, which is finally coming into the schools, is highly suspect. So therefore it is not surprising that eventually what that quality of learning that you are getting from children is as poor as it is. Also, I think one of the things that the teacher training systems do not highlight is the fact that many of these teachers have to confront a classroom with first generation learners, or at best, as Urmi said, children who have maybe only their siblings who've been to school, and that's a very different, and it requires particular kinds of skills and capacities for which the teachers are in all likelihood not trained, and therefore they also get frustrated when they reach a classroom and they face children from those kinds of backgrounds, and so it's just completely a kind of a mess. Now some of the solutions that were offered were, these extra teachers with their volunteers, etc., etc. They have not contributed as well.
When the 6th pay commission was introduced, the salaries of government teachers obviously went up automatically, and the salaries of private teachers were also supposed to go up. But what we saw for several months, there were several teachers who were complaining that the schools have not yet released the salaries, either increased the salaries or not released the arrears, and we saw that for an extended period of time, for more than a year. Maybe in some schools the situation still persists. So the regulatory mechanisms to ensure that teaching continues to be a comfortable or an attractive or a lucrative position, at least it should not decline if the level does not improve. So that the regulatory mechanism also does not seem to be working. Is there a problem in that area?
I suppose there is a problem in that area, but the fact is that government teachers today get paid much better than their private counterparts, but accountability is not that high. The private school teacher knows that if they don't turn up in class, they probably won't have a job. But the government school teacher knows that they can get away. So yes, I mean, I do understand the need for, a regulatory mechanism which ensures that the salary hikes are being delivered, but I would be much more comfortable with a regulatory mechanism that actually looks at teacher accountability. And that is where the problem. I mean, see, half the problem is that there is no accountability.
But it's not in the whole system, actually.
At no part of the system,
teachers should not be made the linchpin here.
Yeah, no, I agree.
With the RTE, that the teacher will be blamed for all the ills in the system. But in fact, there is no accountability in the entire education department, despite the fact that this is a law, and there are a series of legal entitlements. Even at NCPCR, when I was working, we were hard pressed to find where to direct complaints, because one doesn't know that if corporal punishment is taking place, who is responsible? Is it the head teacher? Is it the block officer, the district officer? If there aren't classrooms, is the secretary of the state responsible? Is the block officer responsible? It has not been decided. It hasn't been fixed anywhere in the system. And eventually you can't pile all the blame onto the teacher in the classroom, who has the least support and the least power in that sense to affect the change in the system.
That's exactly where I was coming to. It's very convenient for us to blame the teacher. And the reason why I keep trying to bring the focus back to the teachers, not because one should blame them, but they are the ones who need the most support. Ultimately, it is the teacher who deals with the child, not some secretary in the education department in a state capital or the education ministry at the center. It's the teacher. Unfortunately, and I keep going back to the fact that the further we get away from the capital city, the less supported our teachers are. Imagine a teacher in a Naxal affected area. They not only have to deal with strange regulations, but they have to deal with the fact that, you know, the child may not turn up to class, or has to ensure that the child doesn't get recruited by the Naxals.
Yeah.
So the teacher has a huge responsibility. We may be paying them better. We need better accountability systems, but we also need better support mechanisms. And somewhere along the way, we just get stuck at point one, where we believe that pay is enough. Pay is important, but you need to help them to actually do their job. See, not all teachers in the government school systems are, you know, derelict of their responsibility. There are very good teachers, I'm sure, even today in the system. The point is to find them. The point is to actually encourage them and to support them to be even better. And those who are on the margins, you have to help them to be better. There will be rotten apples everywhere. There are rotten apples in every profession. But we can't tar everybody with the same brush, and you have to find those support mechanisms. Unfortunately, that is one place where there is very little work or effort being done. And moment you support teachers better, I'm sure that learning outcomes will improve.
Okay. Amit, almost time for me to wrap up. So your take on the need for accountability at various levels.
I think that's probably the single most important thing that needs to happen, and that's really the major difference, as both the other panelists have also brought out, between public schools and private schools. The fact that a teacher arrives, is in classroom, and is teaching in a private school is what differentiates it from a government school, where a World Bank study some years ago showed that some 25% teachers at any given point of time are absent. So I think absolutely accountability is the key word.
Well, that's all I have time for. Kiran Bhatti, Amit Kaushik, Urmi Goswami, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for in this edition of Insight. Thank you so much for watching us. Do stay tuned to Lok Sabha Television for more. Namaskar.